Welcome to the program. My guest today is Maurice Apprey. He is a professor of psychiatry and the Dean of African American Affairs at the University of Virginia. His new book is The Key to the Door: Experiences of Early African American Students at the University of Virginia, which he co-edited with Shelley Poe. Maurice, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure indeed.
I've really been looking forward to this. I want to start with what the book is about and explore this idea of the history at the University of Virginia with students of color. But to get us started, I know you have an excerpt from the book that you would like to share.
Right.
Please go right ahead.
Let me start with a visit to Kobe, Japan, about 10 years ago, where I had gone to speak about culture and issues of identity. And here I am introduced by somebody who had applied to the University of Virginia many, many years ago, had not been accepted because he was simply African American. The state of Virginia paid for him to go elsewhere to get his education. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I was so embarrassed. I decided when I came back, I would try and pay homage to the early graduates as at least one way of making up to these students.
So that's part of your inspiration
for
this book, which really does capture the first-hand accounts of those who were on the front lines of changing the American story.
Absolutely.
Here in Virginia.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Here are students who had been in segregated environments, coming to the University of Virginia, thrown into the strange world, perplexed, ashamed, uncertain about how they're going to survive, mostly afraid. So I'll read to you what one of them says.
All right.
About fear.
So you've, in talking to this group of really amazing alumni, you've discovered that fear was indeed a common element of their experience.
As the most underlying theme of their experience.
Wow.
Yes.
So we're all ears. Go right ahead.
Okay. Here's John Merchant.
John Merchant.
The first graduate from the School of Law. He writes, "Fear is a strange thing. It can arrive unexpectedly, though more often it is preceded by some period of apprehension. Then fear appears, heightens, becomes real, and too frequently lingers long. It is difficult to describe fear to someone who has had little or no experience with it. Also, if one lacks a real understanding of the circumstances giving rise to the fear, it can be easily misunderstood, even passed over as trivial. But if the experience is personal, it cannot be forgotten. Conceivably, one must walk a mile in my shoes to fully appreciate my experience. Yes, I have known fear, preceded by apprehension, and I'm not ashamed to admit it." I spoke then to one of the first graduates of the School of Engineering, and he tells me so vividly his first day at the university. He's so terrified that he goes to his room and locks his door. The white students come and bang at the door. Boom, 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 boom. Hardly a wink that night. He wakes up, much to his horror. He had left the key in the door. That's the title of this book.
And that's
the reason.
The key to the door.
The key to the door.
That's why they were banging on the door.
That's banging at the door. And he had, left the key to his room in the lock. And so with his permission, his real story accounts for the title of the book, but also it's a metaphor. It serves as a metaphor for how these early graduates opened the door for so many people to get in
who followed
them,
behind them.
go after them.
Maurice, is there any one common factor among these early students when it comes to dealing with that very real fear and apprehension that was I can't imagine that day to day, every day, that apprehension, that fear. How did they get through it?
For many of them, it lingered long after the fact, long after they graduated. Dr. Womack's story speaks to that somewhat. He speaks of being top of the class, coming out of an educated household, always been expected to do well. He comes to the University of Virginia and he's expected to fail simply because he's African American. And what that speaks to is this sense of loss of an ideal self that you bring with you, and suddenly it's overturned. And it takes many years, even after being successful, getting your degree, to really reconfigure that cohesive sense of self. I get this from when I began to bring them back one by one to the university. I go to a medical convention and I meet Dr. Vivian Penn, who's receiving the key to the city of Oakland, California, for all her medical achievements. And I said to Vivian, you got to come back and speak to our students about your experiences and encourage them to go on, because they think they have suffered, not knowing what you've been through. She says to me, oh no, I can't do that. Some of the same people who gave me a tough time are still there, and I cannot look at their faces one more time.
Really?
You know?
Wow.
So I am not coming. It took me about 3 or 4 tries to eventually get her to come.
And she did come back to ground.
And she eventually did come back to grounds, and saw how many students were there, how exciting it was for them to see her and to hear her stories, and to see her achieve in spite of all the odds.
Right, right.
And she continues to come to this day to inspire and to teach.
Maurice, for
every
those
summer.
For those who don't know, for those who aren't as familiar with the story of the University of Virginia, as you and I are, give us a sketch of when we're talking about and how this unfolded, the breaking that color barrier at a place like the University of Virginia, which of course for generations was known as the University of the American South.
Right.
How did it actually happen?
We're talking about the period 1955 to 1960. And in the early years, the students, the African American students, could only go to the professional schools, engineering, medicine, law, and education. It wasn't until 1960 that they were able to enter the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So we should say that's the second phase of African Americans' place here. The first phase, they couldn't enter. The state paid for them to go elsewhere.
Right.
The second phase, they were here, but it was a horrible experience for them, as they tell it. Some of them even talk about not being able to shop in the corner because they would spoil business, except the Jewish shops. But even then, they couldn't shop on Saturdays and Sundays. Okay, that's the second phase. The third phase is when, around 1979, when students knock on the door of President Hereford and say, we want 2 things from you. Give up your all-white membership in Farmers and Country Club, and we also want a home away from home called the Office of African American Affairs.
And that was a really historic revolutionary moment
Absolutely.
in the timeline of the University of Virginia when it comes to race relations.
Absolutely.
And that push came from student leaders
Came
who
from
stepped
student
up
leaders.
and said, we want to see changes here.
Absolutely. And one of them was the past rector, George Martin, the immediate past rector.
On the Board of Visitors.
On the Board of Visitors.
Yeah, talk about leadership.
No, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
It's a powerful story.
Yes.
Help us understand and illustrate how bad it got. Was there any story that when all of these alumni were speaking from the heart and sharing their story about what happened?
The one that is most difficult for me to even ponder is when John Merchant is ill. He's in hospital, but they would not delay his exam for him. So he has to literally be carried to the law school, take his test, and be taken back to the hospital to continue his test. That one sticks out for me.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
One thinks that a privileged white student might have been given an extension and allowed to make up that test at another time.
More than likely.
Right.
More than likely.
In terms of numbers at the University of Virginia, there was that color barrier was broken
Right.
in the last half of the 1950s,
Right.
and then beginning in the College of Arts and Sciences in the early 1960s.
Right.
But even then,
It was very
it
small.
was decades before we saw any real numbers.
I remember
diversity.
Yeah, no. I remember coming here in 1980, and within a year or two being asked to become an assistant dean of students in the medical school. And I remember going to orientation and seeing 3 black students in the class. And one of them saying to me, "Where are all the other black students?" And I said, "They're all here." He says, "Oh no, they must be late."
There has to be more somewhere.
There has to be more somewhere, you know. He and I still laugh about this, you know, and it's amazing. He's now a urologist, a very successful urologist somewhere.
Yeah.
Right. He was actually here this past weekend for the Black Alumni Weekend.
What is that when you meet with these alumni? Is there some common, looking back on the experience?
Yes.
Is there some common message that they bring?
Yes. It's a process of remembering, feeling respected, and feeling restored. You know, you take one of them to say the Boar's Head with their family members.
Which, for those who don't know, is a resort just west of Charlottesville, just west of the
Right.
university.
Right. And they said, and they remember, oh my God, once upon a time I couldn't eat here. What a joy it is to feel a difference in coming back. And then their children will ask questions about their experience. Things they thought they had told their children, but their children didn't know. So it's a whole process of remembering and remembering with others that goes on and on
Yeah.
and on and on.
And what's so powerful about yours and Shelley's book is that
Yes.
you have insisted that these alumni not take their stories with them.
And not. Absolutely.
That they leave these stories for those who come after them.
Absolutely.
So that we can not just document
Right.
what happened from the
Right.
perspective of these first African American students at UVA, but that we have the lessons there
We have the
to
lessons
learn from.
there. We have. It's one of the inspirations, really, that made me want to do this fully. Teresa Price is one of the local teachers here in whose house there were no student affairs those days, and so Teresa Price was more or less the dean of students, in whose house they all, you know,
Would gather and
gathered and compared notes. They got to know their children. The community members got to know them, and they got to know the community members. Some of them even taught their children how to tie their shoes, and so on and so on and so forth. And when I asked Teresa, what do you think about this idea of getting these graduates back to tell their stories? She said, no.
Really?
It would be too painful for them. That was her first reaction. But then as we started talking with them, they began to warm up to the idea. And the 7 that eventually contributed loved it. Now they hold the book in their hands and feel very proud that they've been restored.
And for those who don't know, it's an interesting note that we would be remiss if we didn't point this out, that the first African-American student was an attorney.
Yes.
Greg had a law degree, Mr. Swanson, Gregory Swanson, who was matriculated as a law student to take some classes, 55? Is that correct? But didn't stay long.
Didn't stay very long, yeah.
And already had a degree, so he wasn't necessarily here to get a degree. He was here to really shatter and destroy that barrier that had long existed.
Yes.
And he did just that.
Yeah, but the difference with John Merchant and others is that they stuck with it.
They stayed.
They stayed. And those 2 words are very important. Staying through it, very, very important. John says, Gregor was here, but he didn't stay but for a hot minute. You know? And, if you want to be vain about it, you want to say he doesn't want his thunder to be stolen from him. But,
John Merchant, yeah.
Yes,
right.
But there's a point here.
Right.
The point about endurance is very, very important. The point about resilience, which we want our students to know. Today we have students who don't think they have to suffer, even moderately.
And that is such a fascinating dynamic.
Right.
And as a teacher at the University of Virginia,
right.
I know exactly what you're talking about. This isn't unique to UVA students. It really is a generational thing that we're seeing among young people today. Right. This real resistance to any kind of suffering, inconvenience.
Right. It's
fascinating.
It's a different world.
It is a different world indeed.
When I first came here in the early 80s, students were always looking back, making sure that nobody hurts them, Today they would walk through fire and not know it. What you want is a balance between risk and caution.
Right.
And so ultimately that's where we hope that our efforts will take them.
Does a university have some kind of responsibility, perhaps, not to put students in harm's way, but to encourage them to take some initiative to maybe take some risks, intellectually, emotionally. It's part of becoming an adult, right? And learning to handle the tough times.
I think it comes naturally. And we don't have to make a special effort. Reality will teach them.
Right. Life is right there all the time.
Life is right there all the time.
Yeah.
Trump's victory was a fascinating...
Tell me about that.
It was a fascinating juncture in their lives. A lot of them grew up thinking, Obama is our president. Then suddenly we have this guy. And their world is just thrown. And they want me to go and give them words of encouragement. And I actually refused. I had to say, it's reality. There are democratic structures in place to contain him, and therefore we don't have to do a thing. It's life. Get through it.
Yeah.
I have other students to take care of. Altria is coming here to teach skills and competencies, such as team building and other things. That is what I'm choosing to do tonight.
Right.
They weren't
tell me
very
about
happy,
the Office of African American Affairs at UVA.
Mm-hmm.
In your work with this really amazing team of people who work there, and the leadership and the services that they offer.
Right.
I'm curious, what's the greatest day-to-day challenge that you face?
To take a longer view, okay, if you think that the early stages our students couldn't even matriculate, and then they come, and they have a horrible time, and then they have the Office of African American Affairs in these early stages. The early stages, the tensions were about, are we getting as much support from the administration as we can? Okay? It's almost as if we had to have an enemy, so to speak. Okay? Now you have presidents who've come and made their mark. I remember President O'Neill, for example, Hereford setting up the office. Then President O'Neill establishing the first viable task force to say, tell us all that's wrong with the university and let's fix it. Okay? And then Castine comes in and brings in access. And then you have President Sullivan, who is so receptive to the students. I don't know any president who's met with a student group 3 times in 1 year, here or anywhere else.
But she has.
But she has.
Right.
So these students have a different kind of challenge. And for me, it's preparing them to a place where we can free them from their parents to get started.
Right.
I read an article in the New York Times not so long ago called $240,000 in debt from Columbia University and still staying home. That shouldn't happen.
Should not
happen. We at the university are obligated to to equip them with skills and competencies that will make them multiply skilled and nimble. Today, no company is the same after 3 years. Innovation, technology, automation is changing the workforce and requiring our students to be so versatile.
Right.
To learn broadly and deeply.
And to have the courage to reinvent themselves. Right.
And to adapt to the changes that are occurring in the environment. That, to me, is the nub. The heart of the matter.
Yeah.
Right. I wake up every morning challenged by that idea and encouraged that I have a team that will help me do that.
And it really is an investment in a young person for their lifetime. Not, hey, I want to help you go get a job and make a lot of money. That's not what this project is about.
That's not what it's about.
It was never what UVA was supposed to be about for its students. It really is to this lifetime that is before them.
Absolutely.
As a citizen.
As a citizen. If you're going to be a black teacher, you must know why you're a teacher and what value added you're going to bring because you're also black. If you're going to be a lawyer, you must know why you're a lawyer and what value added you're going to bring because you have the experience of being African American. All of these are identity issues that we have to really help them work through.
And the greatest strength that you've seen among African American students that enter the workforce is what?
Is that we can do it. We can do precisely what I've just said. When they come back as black alumni and you see all these young faces smiling and very happy, you remember some of them saying to you, do you remember me? I was the one who came to your office one day and you prayed with me. I don't remember that, but that's what they say. But that's okay. You have
and they remember.
They remember it that way.
Yeah. And you see adults who are educated, inspired, and nimble in a rapidly changing
workforce. And succeeding at it.
Thank you, Maurice, for being here.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for all you do. The new book is The Key to the Door, Experiences of Early African American Students at the University of Virginia by Maurice Apprey and Shelley Poe. Why don't you go out and buy a copy right now? It's really a beautiful book. Maurice is the Dean of African American Affairs at the University of Virginia and a professor of psychiatry. You can find a complete archive of this program online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Before I let you go, here's a blast from the past from the Barefoot Excursions archives, a little bit more history at the University of Virginia. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other. Hi, I'm Coy Barefoot here at the University of Virginia. The recent anniversary of the historic March on Washington reminds us of the time that Martin Luther King came to speak here at the university in the spring of 1963. The University of Virginia had taken steps to admit young men of color to their professional schools, but didn't actually admit an African American as a first year until the fall of 1962. Charlottesville, of course, had desegregated its high school and Venable Elementary School in 1959. But the city and the university were still deeply touched by the cancer of racism. And the evening that he spoke at Old Cabell Hall, that's exactly how Martin Luther King referred to racism. It was a cancer. Martin Luther King had been invited to speak at the University of Virginia by the Virginia Council on Human Relations, which brought speakers to UVA who opposed Virginia's laws of racial segregation. He spoke on Monday night, March 25th, 1963, to a less than capacity crowd at Old Cabell Hall. Most of the African Americans there, of course, were local residents from Charlottesville. Dr. King said that desegregation since the 1954 Supreme Court decision had moved at a normal snail-like pace, and he passionately affirmed that segregation is a cancer which must be removed. We don't have much time, he said, and we can't afford to slow up. That night, following his electrifying speech at Old Cabell Hall, Martin Luther King stayed here in this motel on Emmett Street that is now the Budget Inn. Dr. King's speech here at the University of Virginia came on the eve of the transformation of the civil rights movement in America. Just a few days later, he would be arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, and it was there in that jail that he wrote Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And of course, just a few months later, the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. It was also that night when Dr. King was staying here in this motel in Charlottesville that he mentioned to Professor Gaston, one day somebody's going to try to take a shot at me. Someone will try to kill me. And tragically, that's exactly what happened. 5 years later, almost to the day, at a little motel much like this in Memphis, Tennessee.